Welcome. This is not karaoke, but it's great to be here. Even some of us in the room would find this way more fun than karaoke anyway. So welcome. I'm so glad to see everybody here. My name is Matthew Scott. I lead the Human Rights and Environment thematic area at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in Lund, in Sweden. I'm joined by my colleague Wendy Arini, who runs our Jakarta office and the Regional Asia program on human rights and environment. And we're here today supporting the Capacity Building Hub, which is focusing on human mobility today. So this is a fantastic initiative, and it's also a pleasure to have this particular session with you today, which is talking about human rights-based approaches to climate action, unlocking the what, why, and how. And so what's the starting point for all of this? I'll make sure I don't go off track. So I want to start by, since we're in the Capacity Building Hub, and I have a practice of being a facilitator of learning, we often talk about learning outcomes. So this is a pretty short session, so the ambition level is not overly dramatic, but if we think as a capacity building initiative on learning outcomes, the goal of today is that you'll be able to go away being able to understand and to some extent explain the relevance of human rights-based approaches to action on climate, particularly in the context of human mobility. And this is something that we've been working quite a lot on with partners in different parts of the world. And we're also joined by partners Swed Bio and Tristan, who I'll introduce more in a second, from the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. What's the Convention on Biological Diversity doing in the UNFCCC context, talking about human mobility? Well, I'll tell you, the human rights dimension cuts across all of these post-2015 frameworks. The Agenda 2030 on Sustainable Development, human rights is integral to that process. If you read Agenda 23, it emphasizes the importance of integrating human rights perspectives. The Paris Agreement, let me read that one for you, since we're within a Paris context here today. It says in the preamble, parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, this is a long list, and that's part of the how now, respect, promote and consider their respective obligations on human rights, the right to health, the rights of indigenous peoples, local communities, migrants, children, persons with disabilities, and people in vulnerable situations, and the right to development, as well as gender equality, empowerment of women, and intergenerational equity. Amongst all of the other things that national and subnational actors are doing in terms of action on climate, they've got to be human rights lawyers, right, as well. Because, I mean, what's the right to health? What's the right to development? There's massive amounts of information, standards, guidelines that can inform that kind of work. But if you're a mayor in a local authority whose job is, amongst other things, disaster risk reduction, town planning, action on climate, urban development, etc., it's going to be a difficult ask to get across all of these international standards and guidelines. So we need support, and we're at the Capacity Development Hub today to talk about how to integrate human rights perspectives into action on climate in a way that has operational relevance. So it's not abstract, but practical methods for doing this work that can be mainstreamed and spread out in ways that work for different actors. So we get to the how. I think, well, there's a little bit of why as well. Why? Well, it's in the Paris Agreement, so you ought to do it. But also why? Because action on climate, as well as inaction on climate, has obvious human impacts. We hear about it all over the place. Whether it's people who are displaced in flooding, or whether it's people who are forced to leave as a consequence of mitigation initiative. So we're going to set up a solar farm, and unfortunately you'll have to move on. There's human rights dimension to that as well. So we can talk more about the why, but I really want to move over to hearing from our partner Ashan Puri Hertz, who's joining us online, because she's going to talk about one of the parts of the how, which emphasizes in particular the participation dimension. So how do we get multiple voices into a room, including hers? Puri, are you with us? While she's connecting, I'm just going to introduce her. She is Program Officer at Swed Bio, and she's going to be introducing the multi-actor dialogue and sharing with us what she has been experiencing recently at the Convention on Biological Diversity in Cali in Colombia just a couple of weeks ago. So I wonder if I should pause or just ad lib for a second. While we're waiting for her to connect, I can say a thing or two about participation by way of opening up for her. This is one of the, let's have a little bit of background. We hear participation referenced all around the COP. It's one of the most critical dimensions of ensuring that everybody's voice is heard, that nobody is left behind, and well, I'll leave it to Puri to not leave her behind. Hi Puri, can you hear us? Not quite. I can see you. You can hear us, but we can't hear you. Nope. Maybe now. I'll continue where I left off. Puri, just speak a couple times at different intervals, and we'll see if we get you in. Otherwise, we do have Tristan here who will be able to tell us a little bit more about it. But participation, as we've heard, is one of these core dimensions. And I think that's something that we can say about a human rights-based approach before we introduce the kind of broader methodology that we've been developing at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, which includes this participation element, but lots of other dimensions of a human rights-based approach. It's worth saying at this point that there's no claim in this space that a human rights-based approach presents a bunch of new ideas that aren't talked about anywhere else. So a lot of the elements of a human rights-based approach are already reflected, particularly in calls from civil society. We hear this from indigenous groups, we hear this from local communities who say we need a space at the table in decision-making processes, whether that's at local disaster management committees or at international events like this. Hearing from affected people is critical for not only the enjoyment of the right to public participation, which is enshrined in international human rights law, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, amongst others, but also simply for the operational practicality. If you don't include people in these decisions that affect their lives, as we'll see in a scenario later in this process, if you don't include them, processes often fail. So it's just bad practice to not include people's voices in this connection. And I think, Puri, we may lose you at this point, but maybe I'll hand over to Tristan, who can say a little bit about the multi-actor dialogues in your capacity. Tristan Tyrell is the Program Management Officer for Biodiversity, Climate Change, and Dry and Subhumid Lands at the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Tristan, let's hand over to you. Sorry, Puri, but we'll connect possibly in a bit.
Thanks very much, Matt. Hello, everyone. Sorry, I'm trying not to put my back. Sorry, Puri, I'm going to have to put my back to you, I'm afraid. Yes, indeed. So actually, Puri sent me her what she had planned to say yesterday, just in case there were any sort of technical difficulties this morning. So a bit of foresight there. But she was highlighting the role that SwedBio plays in terms of facilitating and enabling the sharing of knowledge and the ability to connect across different peoples and processes at different scales. How that knowledge exchange from the local to the global, and especially in the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity, it's that local level knowledge, understanding and practice that is fundamental in terms of helping us to move forward and actually conserve, protect and restore biodiversity. Which ultimately underpins all of our societies, all of our health and well-being, all of our economies. The HRBA process, this dialogue process that SwedBio initiated with other partners, including Sokokai International, South North CDKN, and with the BESNet consortium, allowed the engagement with multiple actors and stakeholders in this process to understand what exactly does human rights-based approaches mean in the context of biodiversity and climate action. So within the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, the concept of human rights-based approach was introduced and accepted by the parties. And it's one of the cross-cutting principles that is supposed to govern the implementation of the 4 goals and the 23 action-orientated targets. The targets themselves have to be achieved by 2030 with the intention of putting us on the path towards living in harmony with nature by 2050, which is the long-term vision for this. But it's a single line in the sort of the chapeau of the framework. And so the question is, well, what does that mean to people and how can we actually implement it? If you look in the targets themselves, there are references to rights in particular related to Indigenous peoples, local communities, largely around territorial rights, but there's also about respecting their knowledge, culture and practices. And then there are other aspects relating to gender that also has a specific target within the framework. Within that, what we call Section C, those cross-cutting considerations, there is also recognition of intergenerational equity and recognizing that we are the custodians of this planet for future generations. It's not just about ourselves. And then there are other things related to whole of society as well as whole of government approach, so that they're recognizing that there are roles for everyone, frankly, but in particular, it's not just the small office that manages biodiversity within perhaps the Ministry of Environment, but actually everyone has a role, including those who, frankly, sometimes we see as, in inverted commas, the bad guys as such. So what is the role of the private sector in this? What is the role for civil society, for academia, and for community groups and others, including Indigenous peoples as well, of course. And so this dialogue process has helped to bring some of those groups together to understand, well, what does human rights-based approach mean in your specific context? What are you looking to see? But also to try and understand, well, what are the barriers? And that's not just for the rights holders who are looking to see this whole broad concept being advanced, especially when it comes to policy making and implementation, but also for those duty bearers themselves to understand, well, what are your perspectives on this? What is perhaps the barriers in your context? What's potentially holding you back? And that's not just governments, but also in terms of civil society. What's the role of non-governmental organizations in this? How can you both facilitate taking a human rights-based approach, but also recognizing that to a certain extent they are also duty bearers? And then there was another group that's focusing on sort of academia and research, again as part of that sort of knowledge exchange, learning and helping to translate that into what policymakers need, but also for the people themselves on the ground. so that they understand, well, what does human rights mean in your context, and how can you be communicating it better to those that frankly should be doing more. As Matt mentioned, we've just had our own COP16 in Cali, Colombia, a couple of weeks ago, and this was the first time that parties have come together as a COP since the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework 2 years ago, where human rights-based approach language was adopted within the framework, but we're already seeing that some parties are looking to roll that back. So while there might be some champions in the room, because it is a party-led process based on consensus, it comes down essentially to the lowest common denominator, and so there was some give and take there again, even just 2 years later in the negotiations. And of course, as parties are now developing or revising their national biodiversity strategies and action plans, our equivalent of NDCs and NAPs, etc., we want to see how the interpretation of that is being taken forward in an actual progressive sort of manner. The COP itself was the first stock-taking opportunity since then. So we've seen a number of national targets that have been set relative to the GBF, but what we're not seeing is how Section C is being interpreted. That will be in the broader NBSAP, and those are slowly trickling in. So of course, we need to see processes like this multi-actor dialogue process engaging with those parties, those duty bearer groups or duty bearers, to actually see this being taken forward in a mutually understanding and supportive manner. And that was essentially one of the aspirations with the process, was that it was a safe space to discuss some of these challenges. The issue now is not just the revision of the NBSAP, but the implementation of it, and that is where it's going to be groups like RWI and SWEDBio and CDKN, but also all those other agencies that participated in the various dialogues throughout this process to support parties, to support governments, to ensure that when it comes to implementation, that they are doing what they should, but also because of that whole society approach, that they're engaging with the private sector and some of the others who also have a very important role to play. Thanks very much.
So thank you so much, Tristan, for introducing the multi-stakeholder, multi-actor dialogue. It's obviously a critical dimension in ensuring the participation component of human rights-based approaches to action on climate, biodiversity, sustainable development, etc. And it's very helpful to have that language in these high-level decisions because it provides us a bit of an impetus and a bit of an anchor when we want to then operationalize human rights in action on climate, including in the mobility space. So what I'm going to be talking about is managing climate-related human mobility with FIRE. So I'll be introducing primarily this framework, which is the framework for integrating human rights and gender equality. And it's got a long history, sort of. We started working on this human rights-based approach to human mobility at the start of our Regional Asia-Pacific program on human rights and environment, starting with a regional thematic study on the human rights dimensions of disaster displacement in 10 countries across Asia and the Pacific. And the method was to begin to consolidate international standards and guidelines into a method for being able to evaluate existing national law, policy, and practice. But what becomes particularly relevant is the practice dimension. It's fine for me as an international human rights lawyer to evaluate legal and policy documents, but what really matters is how local actors on the ground implement human rights perspectives, and we can't have as a starting point an expectation that there is deep familiarity with the thousands of pages of standards and guidelines that make up the human rights law canon relevant to disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, climate-related human mobility. So the FIRE framework has as its ambition the making accessible of core human rights standards and guidelines in a manner that you can look at on a single page and start to ask relevant questions. So it's not making a claim that if you integrate FHIR, you will get the answers to really complex challenges, but rather that it will help to make sure that important questions that emerge from the consolidation of practice around the world that's committed to human dignity is not forgotten. So I'm going to talk fairly quickly just about what the standards are before referencing some of the 6 dimensions that make up the framework, but I want to save time for us to then dive into it. And this is a bit of a test for FHIR, because I want to make the claim that just looking at this, this slide, we'll be able to at least think about core dimensions relevant to particular mobility scenarios. And we're going to hand out a scenario. You can also get it on a QR code, so we can apply our knowledge in the limited time we've got available. So, so the background is, moving on from that process on working specifically on the human mobility dimension from a human rights perspective. We then collaborated with the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, the Stockholm Environment Institute, and the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency to formulate this transdisciplinary framework. From our part, for the human rights dimension, we consolidated about 25 standards from human rights treaty monitoring bodies, but also operational standards like the SPHERE standards, the Interagency Standing Committee guidelines, which expressly adopt a human rights-based approach, but are pretty long and it's hard to digest. So we've tried to digest it into these 6 dimensions. The two dimensions relate to human rights law, but they also come more from a feminist political ecology perspective. And that was brought primarily by Stockholm Environment Institute, enabling us to dive beneath the surface of human rights law standards to the complex social realities that underpin differential exposure and vulnerability to climate-related risk, including mobility risks. So I want to just mention the 6 dimensions and highlight what these bits of text around the diagram relate to. So the 4 kind of core iteratively generated dimensions that come from human rights law standards and guidelines are the governance systems and structures dimension, the fundamental rights and equality, which I contend provides substantial depth to our understanding of the human impact of action or inaction on climate, and we'll get to that. The non-discrimination dimension, leaving no one behind in the language of the SDGs, participation and access to information, which we talked a bit already about. These are the kind of human rights law canon, both from the operational dimension as well as from the international normative standards perspective. And then we get into the social norms and context, which is really diving into underlying conditions that contribute to the differential exposure and vulnerability, how power circulates within society. And this is the gender analysis that helps us to see what makes some people more exposed in different contexts. That also carries over to the agency and empowerment dimension, where it's important as a programmatic perspective to cease to view people who are exposed to disaster risk as victims or beneficiaries, and really emphasizing the agency and capacity and capabilities of people to make decisions about their lives and to reflect the expertise that they have about the particular context that they're living and working in. All these bits of text around the edges reflect key standards that you can dive even deeper into in this consolidated standards and guidelines handbook. So you can see in the margins there some of the sources that we've drawn from in consolidating the standards and guidelines. I'm not going to read through it because I really want us to get to the scenario, but you can see the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights produced general comments quite some time ago on the right to adequate housing. And it helps us to think not just about shelter as four walls and a roof, but housing in its social context, relating to a healthy and safe environment, relating to things like land tenure. So this is the point about getting a bit of normative depth. So we're not just talking about houses for people, but we're talking about safe living environments where people can thrive and have a dignified life to the maximum of available resources of the state where people are living in. So it's not trying to set the bar to an impossible level where we can then point to a country that's experiencing the sharp end of climate emergency and say, look, people have inadequate housing, it's a human rights violation. We could frame it in the language of a denial of human rights because people are not able to enjoy the minimum core or even raising the aspirations higher. But anyway, you can dive deeper in your own time. I want us to use the time to try to test this scenario. But since we're also talking about capacity building, I just wanted to pitch one of the contexts where we've actually implemented this FIRE framework in the context of urban climate-related human mobility. We had a process supported by the Swedish Institute working with local government in Nairobi, Kampala, and Freetown, where we used the FIRE framework to ask relevant questions. And this is kind of the core pitch of the FIRE framework, is that it helps us to ask relevant questions of people in context who have depth of context-specific expertise. So we're asking these questions together in a mutual learning environment to generate knowledge for action. So this climate displacement in African cities Kampala city profile, for instance, which you can find on our website, deep dives looking at those 6 dimensions of the FIRE framework from the vernacular perspective of local government in those cities. And the process was a joint capacity building process. So I learned a lot, they learned a lot from each other in this peer-to-peer, multi-sectoral, it was local government, so it wasn't multi-stakeholder, but it was also multi-level engagement. So we're seeing national government perspective, local government perspective on this complex challenge of climate-related human mobility in cities, using the FIRE framework to ask relevant questions. Because if we don't ask relevant questions, it's often going to go wrong. And one of the best examples we have of action going wrong is planned relocation. We talked about it a lot yesterday, and we're going to use a scenario here to test your perception. It's not graded, and it's anonymous as well. But I want to encourage you to first hit the QR code for the scenario. We've got some that we can put on the tables as well. I think we've got maybe even 10, so we could pass some around to people who don't fit in the tables. Read the scenario. It's only 1 page. It's part of a larger scenario that we developed in another project, part of the collaboration with the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, Stockholm Environment, and Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency. We had a regional technical working group on early warning, evacuation, and camp management, where we trialed the FIRE framework as well. And that scenario that you have a chunk of is part of it. So take some time to read. I'm not sure what our time looks like right now, but we're doing fine. So maybe spend 5 minutes reading, and then you can go to the next QR code. And it's a simple test. Simply in your own perspective, it's a Mentimeter. It's almost as good as Slido. But you go there and you can just identify to what extent you see the 6 dimensions of the FIRE framework reflected in the scenario that you're reading about, which is about planned relocation. So it's just a way to say, okay, even just a snapshot helps us to ask relevant questions. At least that's my perspective. And you might also find, I hope you can read while I talk, but you might also find that not each of the dimensions is as apparently relevant in any given scenario. So it's not always the case that you will find directly relevant all of the 6 dimensions of the FIRE framework and all of the associated elements of the dimensions, but use the elements to help you to think, well, could that be something in this scenario? Because that's the whole idea, that we're asking the question and we're maybe prompted to think about questions that we might not think about just on the surface. So read and then we'll start seeing your feedback, although we won't see it on the screen. And I think I have to start the Menti here. I think I have to start it on my computer. Great. So we can see your responses coming up as well. Yeah, so there's a question, the not very prominent means I don't really see much of this dimension here. much as data monitoring. Try using the circle. We have an office in Nairobi. We work a lot with the African Union. How are we going? I'm kind of, I don't want to stress you. We've got time, but I don't want you to get bored looking at your phones for other reasons. We give it 2 more minutes. The reason being is I'm going to talk less and you're going to talk more. Okay, we're back. I think what we can do now, we've got 20 minutes left, right? That means we have the opportunity to talk through your reflections on the scenario, but also we can hear about your reflections on the framework as well. This is the fastest possible introduction to the FIRE framework we've ever done. Other times we have week-long collaborations or even over the course of a year in a blended learning sort of context. So there's a possibility to dive much deeper, but I think it's worth us today testing this snapshot approach. So are we able to see these dimensions in a scenario? So we've got this survey that's come up, what we have here is a scenario of people having been displaced in a flood kind of a setting. They're living in informal settlements, and then a decision is made to relocate a population to a place 20 kilometers outside of town. There's no land title, first come, first served, a bit of money to set yourself up, limited access to water, quite a distance back to town, and ultimately the project fails at a cost of $200,000 for 200 people, $1,000, $100 each. Okay, sorry, don't come to me for math. But come to me for human rights. Let's talk about the governance systems and structures dimension. This has multiple elements, and I think these elements have resonance here. I've thought about the scenario a lot, though, and you have just read it and reflected on it and commented. So what elements of the governance dimension do you see reflected in the scenario? Anybody want to pitch in on this? It's there. I can give you a pointer to how I would approach this, and maybe then you can jump in because it's participatory, right? So the governance systems and structures dimension clearly has a relevance in this context. If you look at the elements, and you can see it either on your screens or in the papers that we handed out, you can see, I think at the top of it is this legal and policy framework that integrates human rights perspective. So we're moving from like Paris Agreement preamble to national law and policy that reflects these international standards and guidelines. Sometimes at the national level, it's still pretty vague. It says, you know, even the word human rights might be all you see in there. Or it could have something about participation. Or it could have something about the constitutional right to shelter, because we know national constitutions are relevant in this context as well. The right to housing, the right to a safe environment is prominent in a lot of national constitutions. So having that legal and policy framework as a starting point is an important dimension. That feeds back also to the discussion we just had in the previous session on the NAPs. So integrating human rights language into national adaptation policies, having already done the work to integrate human mobility considerations into that context, provides a possibility for systematic, I'm not going to say trickle down, but systematic action down to subnational levels as well. So if we have the national legal and policy context, what you might get at the subnational context is standard operating procedures or local disaster management plans, land use planning or land use plans that reflect consideration of the other dimensions of the FIRE framework. And that probably isn't the case in this context because we don't see so much reflection of the human rights perspective in this relocation initiative. But it could also be that the national legal and policy framework looks great. It's a gold standard, but we get to the perennial issue of implementation. So how do we then get local actors to think about human rights dimensions? It goes beyond national law and policy and down into some of the other elements of the governance systems and structures, thinking about data and monitoring, thinking about capacity, resources, budgets. All of these are not just picked out of a straw hat, but they're reflected in these international standards and guidelines that we've consolidated. So this is international good practice based on contexts that have been engaged with over the 75 years of the human rights process. We've got a comment to the back.
Good morning. My name is Hamilton Temb. I'm from Mozambique. I'm representing the Minister of Economy and Finance. I want to try to bring our experience when we are talking about mobility, all those processes about adaptations, budgeting, because I work in the direction of planning and budgeting. So when it comes to to talk about the climate change. The first challenge that we have is that we don't have a specific budget for this subject. And this subject doesn't belong only to the sector who deal with the climate change, because it's transversal. Sorry for my English, it's not that good. So all of us, we have this responsibility. But the way how we advocate to collect this budget, I think that sometimes it's wrong, because we see it from the top to the ground. But who protects the earth is the ground. Because the top is living in the city. When the floods come, we see it on television. But who are really dealing with the floods, who protect the nature, is the one who should be the most important stakeholders. So I want in this matter to congratulate and express my gratitude to UNCDF and UNDP, who have been working with in a project in Mozambique which we call Local, where they work from the bottom to the top. But they don't have all the resources that they need to make huge actions. Because what I think is that we need to create space. You think that you can solve the problem of someone who you don't know how they live in their day-to-day, how they manage their life. You see it from the distance. But if you approach and you ask, you create space. You try to use these policies from the top to involve the process of education, for example, and talk about the climate change in the schools from the ground. Because when the floods again comes, the children only knows that yesterday I was able to go to school, I was able to join my friends, but today I cannot do it. And the most vulnerable persons, we see it in SDG 5. Elders, children are those who suffers a lot. And the humans, by the default, they are more stronger than immense, if we see it. Because they care their children, they do everything that they can to make it work. And the other big issue that we have, the big punchline, is that in Mozambique, we don't have we don't have a government building houses for society. It's a single person who tries to find out the way how they can build their house. And imagine, will not be resilient. And when the climate change comes, takes everything away. Talking about mobility, on the top, you think only to take the people to the safe place, but you don't think about the traumas, because you are changing their life. So I think that is the time for us to stop to talk in a political way and actually do things, because we are humans. We are humans and we need to have more empathy. It's not only about to collect resources, have a lot of budget, talk about numbers, giving a report to have more budget. No, it's not about that. It's about actually see others. You have this privilege to advocate for them. But how you implement those policies, how do you involve them? Instead of to take those budgets and put in the project, highly projects, no. It's for those people. How does you can give this money to those people to build a resilient house, to have a resilient school, and all those kind of things. So I don't know if I made it in complicated way, but it's something that I really feel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's so many good reflections in there that I could connect with. I'll connect with a few, but it may also have sparked other people thinking and wanting to comment as well. But this point about kind of the bureaucratization and financialization, we're certainly recognizing the importance of finance. This is the finance COP almost. So the money is an important dimension, but like you said, it's not about sort of budget lines and high-level infrastructure projects, but how does it reach people? And not just how does it reach people, but how do people contribute to the design and implementation of measures that affect their lives? So it's not bureaucrats from the capital saying, now we're going to build a road, or now we've got 100,000 for some housing somewhere, without taking into account social norms and context. In the scenario that we've got on planned relocation, just a simple example, we've got money there, $100 per relocated family. People thinking about the gender dimension there might wonder, is it the head of household, the male head of household? How's the money allocated? What happens, and this happens all over the place, female-headed households might not even be eligible in some contexts. So how do you deal with the social norms and context at different levels of government and non-government? And that social norms and context part is super important in this context, because we're thinking not just about the relationship between national government and municipal government and the people that those states serve, but also the relationships within the society between men and women, between older people, like you mentioned, and younger people, between different ethnic groups. How do you tackle these dimensions as well? And certainly not the only answer is multi-level, multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral dialogue reflecting a human rights-based approach. That sounds kind of formulaic. You know, the world is super complicated, but I really think that this framework helps us to dive into some of those complex questions without giving the answers. And I think this is the real takeaway, that a framework like this that reflects international standards and guidelines isn't a patch that you can say, well, we've got a human rights-based approach in there too, and we've got our environmental impact assessment, sort of. It's not a tick box exercise. It's a dialogue facilitator. So that's why I put this example of the climate displacement in African cities snapshot up there and the Kampala city profile to show this is the process. So you might have the budget office in the room as well as the community development officer, ideally also representatives from the affected communities who can say, you guys don't know what we experience at all. And that's often the case. When you just talk between state actors, multi-level, multi-sectoral, they'll often admit, we don't actually know. In a number of these contexts, there's a huge information gap. People get displaced in informal urban settlements. Who gets displaced? Where do they go? How long do they stay displaced for? What are the ongoing impacts? You talked about the mental health dimension. What happens in people's lives? And the best way to answer that is not points on a chart or data kind of graphs, but it's hearing from the vernacular people's voices. But you've got to be able to hear the vernacular in a way that can also work at the national level. How do you take the vernacular into national adaptation planning and stuff like that? Well, you need a systematic framework. So we ask the same kind of questions, but the answers might be very different. And I think that's what we can often miss when we don't ask all of the questions. We just get kind of a lot of assumptions, and we often don't hear from most affected people. Thinking about that participation dimension. But thinking about that participation dimension, I saw a hand up.
Hi, my name is Hortense Nanskawagambe. I'm from Rwanda. I'm representing the World Association of Girl Guides and Girl Scouts. I want to talk about two things from the case scenario, about respect and inclusion. Basically, the affected community were not consulted about the eviction, because when you are making decision to people, you have to consult them. You have to involve them in that decision you are taking, because they are the one who are being affected And another thing about respect, even though the government want to move people to a safer place, but forcing eviction without ensuring adequate living condition is not ensuring rights of people. So if you are telling people to evict to another place, don't force them. Yeah, but ensure living condition, because they got there to a new place, they find there is no water, they are walking many kilometers, there is no buses to take them to the place they want. So yeah, that is a problem. Thank you.
Yeah, such a good analysis. It really fulfills my wildest dreams to hear you recognize that, because this is at the heart of the problematic situation that a human rights-based approach can help us to talk about. You talk about forced evictions. How many times around the world over the decades have government authorities forcibly evicted people from places where, for different reasons, they think they shouldn't live? It turns out quite a lot. And it turns out that the treaty monitoring bodies, which don't have an enforcement capacity, so it's a talking shop, but it's an important talking shop, because over decades of hearing from civil society, shadow reports, as well as from states making reports about their fulfillment of their obligations under the human rights treaties, here the right to adequate housing under the convention, the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, we get a consolidation of practice from around the world. We see people get hurt in eviction situations all the time. Let's try to think about things we need to think about if it does happen that forced eviction is required. Because at least under the guidance, the general comment number 7 from the committee, that general comment recognizes that sometimes states might have to force people to leave, but it must be in accordance with the law, and it must have recognition, or you can't. The evacuation can't result in a denial of the minimum core of the right to adequate housing, like you said. So if you drop people 20 kilometers out of town with a couple of steaks and $100 and said, you know, you're welcome, it's not a rights-based approach, and it fails. And I think that's also an important takeaway, that if you don't adopt this rights-based approach, you end up failing in a project. And so the cost-benefit analysis could also inform integrating rights perspectives, because otherwise, you know, everybody's back at the exposed location. Tristan?
No, Puri.
Oh, good. Yes. Can we hear her? Let's try. If this is a good opportunity to say, Puri has recorded comments that she was going to be presenting. We will put her comments on the event page for the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. Let's see if you've got a QR code for that. People who followed the QR code will come to... no, you won't. I'm going to leave a bunch of cards at the door. Those who want to hear Puri's remarks, which I strongly encourage you to do, pick up my card. There's a QR code on that, which will take you to the human mobility space, and then you navigate to the COP29 page, and we'll put her comments there. Because if I can say as we close, this multi-actor dialogue is so important as a method for hearing the different voices of people in a multi-stakeholder context. Because it's not always going to be good enough to just have local people talking amongst themselves. We need to integrate the stakeholders in different kinds of dialogues in order to enhance the measures that are taken to address their situation in climate emergency. So I think we are out of time, but don't run out, because I'm going to put my cards there and then you can pick them up and follow for more. And I'm here all day, so if you want to talk about human mobility and human rights, come say hi. Thank you so much for participating.